One thing before we begin, subscribe now, because what we found this time might just be the most surprising yet. Central Africa's oldest bones don't belong to anyone alive today. That single fact, confirmed by DNA, not speculation, undoes a story that has stood for over a century. A rock shelter cut into the hills above the Congo Basin's northern edge holds skeletons older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. Two individuals, buried at the same site, separated from each other by roughly 5,000 years, one dating back approximately 8,000 years, the other closer to 3,000. For decades, they sat in storage as a curiosity. Then genetic sequencing turned them into a problem. Here is the problem stated plainly. The people who have lived in and around the Congo rainforest for tens of thousands of years, communities long assumed, in textbook after textbook, to be the region's original inhabitants, carry almost no direct ancestry from these ancient skeletons. Not a small amount, almost none. The deepest-rooted population in Central Africa turns out to be, genetically, closer to distant strangers on the other side of the continent than to the ancient dead buried in their own backyard. Modern population genetics has found something that unsettles a founding assumption of African prehistory, that today's rainforest communities are an unbroken genetic thread running back to the region's earliest people. That thread, it turns out, may have been cut. An entire origin narrative, who has always lived in Central Africa, whose ancestors walked this specific ground first, is being rewritten by a single ancient DNA study. So if the oldest bones in the Congo Basin belong to no one alive today, whose ancestors were they, and where did they go? For over a century, the accepted story of Central Africa's peoples has rested on one word: expansion. The story goes like this. Somewhere near the border of modern Nigeria and Cameroon, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, a population speaking early Bantu languages began to grow and move. They didn't stay put. They pushed southeast, into and through the rainforest, then fanned out south and east across the continent, eventually reaching the Great Lakes region, then southern Africa, within a few thousand years. It is considered, in linguistic circles, one of the largest demographic and linguistic expansions in recorded human history, a wave that replaced or absorbed hundreds of earlier local languages as it spread. The mechanism usually offered is what researchers call the farmer-forager framework. Incoming Bantu-speaking agriculturalists arrived carrying iron tools and cultivated crops, technology that let them extract more food from less land than the people already living there. Those existing populations were rainforest hunter-gatherers, groups historically labeled pygmies, a term that includes communities such as the Baka, the Aka, the Mbuti, and the Twa. Under this model, farmers moved in. Foragers stayed in the deep forest, sidestepped rather than replaced. The evidence marshaled for this picture is genuinely broad. Think of it as three independent witnesses telling the same story. Pottery styles trace the same southeastward path. Iron smelting sites cluster along the same timeline. Language tree reconstructions, built by comparing vocabulary and grammar across hundreds of Bantu languages, point to the same origin region and the same order of dispersal. Pottery, ironwork, language trees. Three separate methods, one converging answer, which is exactly why the theory hardened into consensus. From that convergence came a tidy modern picture. Bantu-speaking farmers as the demographic majority across Central and Southern Africa, and rainforest hunter-gatherer groups as a small, ancient, genetically pure remnant, a population predating the farmers, untouched and unchanged, a living fossil of what Central Africa looked like before agriculture arrived. That picture didn't stay in academic journals. It shaped textbooks. It shaped ethnographic assumptions repeated in documentaries and museum placards. It even shaped how the United Nations and international NGOs framed the indigenous status of Central African forest communities in policy documents. But the assumption underneath all of it, that today's rainforest hunter-gatherers are the direct, unbroken descendants of the region's earliest inhabitants, the very people whose bones we'd expect to find in a rock shelter like this one, is exactly where the story starts to fracture. In 2020, a team of geneticists sequenced ancient DNA from the Shum Laka rock shelter in Cameroon. The result didn't fit either side of the accepted story. The work came from Mark Lipson, David Reich, and colleagues at Harvard Medical School and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published in the journal Nature. What they found was not a missing piece slotting neatly into the Bantu expansion puzzle. It was a piece that didn't belong to the puzzle at all. The ancient Shum Laka individuals turned out to be what geneticists call an outgroup, a population that sits outside, not inside, the ancestry of both modern groups it should logically connect to. Not ancestral to modern Bantu speakers. Not ancestral to modern rainforest hunter-gatherers either. Genetically, they belong to neither of the two populations that supposedly descend from the region's deep past. Here is where it gets complicated. Think of a population's DNA like a river system feeding into the present day. Every group alive today should trace back to at least one branch of that system. The Shum Laka lineage barely feeds anywhere. Their genetic branch appears to have gone extinct, or very nearly so, contributing little to no ancestry to any population living in Central Africa today. A lineage that existed for thousands of years, buried at the exact geographic center of the region's founding migration story, essentially vanishes from the gene pool. And the location makes this worse, not better. Shum Laka sits directly inside the proposed homeland region for the Bantu expansion, the very place where, according to the consensus, the ancestors of modern Bantu-speaking farmers are supposed to have originated. Yet the ancient skeletons found at that exact site don't look ancestral to the people who supposedly expanded outward from it. This recontextualizes everything laid out a moment ago. The settled consensus implied a clean chain of continuity. Ancient forager becomes early, Bantu farmer becomes, in isolated forest pockets, modern hunter-gatherer, each generation passing the baton to the next. But the actual ancient genome suggests something closer to a population turnover. Whoever lived at Shum Laka 8,000 and 3,000 years ago was, for the most part, not absorbed into later populations. They were replaced. Clean. Expected. Neither word applies here. There's a second layer of anomaly sitting underneath the first. Modern rainforest hunter-gatherer groups aren't even a single unified population themselves. Western Central African groups, such as the Baka and Biaka, and Eastern groups, such as the Mbuti, are themselves deeply divergent from one another. Split-time estimates range from roughly 20,000 to 60,000 years ago. That is not the genetic signature of one ancient pygmy population that simply spread across the rainforest. That is the signature of separate, ancient lineages that have been diverging from each other since long before agriculture, long before the Bantu expansion, long before most of the timeline this story is supposedly built on. And there's a third layer stranger still. Researchers are careful to frame this next part as probability, not certainty, but several independent studies, Shia and colleagues in 2016, published in Genome Research, and earlier work by Lachance and colleagues in 2012, have detected genetic signatures in rainforest hunter-gatherer genomes consistent with admixture from an unknown, deeply diverged hominin lineage. A ghost population, in the field's own terminology, or a super-archaic one, a lineage that split from the rest of the human family hundreds of thousands of years ago, long predating even the divergence between modern humans and Neanderthals in some estimates. The bones say one population vanished almost without a trace. The genomes of the living say another population may be carrying DNA from something that isn't fully modern human at all. Two mysteries, sitting inside the same patch of rainforest. The first explanation scientists reach for is the simplest one available. Replacement, not descent. This returns to Lipson and colleagues' 2020 Nature paper, alongside supporting population genetics work on African diversity from researchers including Estella Poloni and Alessia Ranciaro. The theory, often called population turnover, holds that a wave of foragers ancestral to the Shum Laka individuals once occupied the region contributed almost nothing genetically to the populations that came after them and were largely displaced during the Bantu-associated migrations that swept through the same territory centuries later. Some models attach a specific number to that displacement, estimating that less than 5 to 10% of Shum Laka-related ancestry survives in any modern Central African population. Framed plainly, a near-total genetic replacement in a region where the archaeological record shows exactly the kind of rapid cultural upheaval that could cause it. Pottery styles change in this window. Agriculture appears in this window. Ironworking spreads in this window. The theory fits the timeline it needs to fit, but the theory has a hole in it, and it's not a small one. Replacement doesn't explain why a population would vanish almost without leaving genetic trace behind. Disease has been proposed, warfare has been proposed, absorption that somehow left no lasting genetic signal has been proposed. None of these explanations has been confirmed. Each is a guess standing in for an answer nobody actually has. And there's a second problem, one that cuts even deeper. If replacement was as total as the models suggest, why do modern rainforest hunter-gatherer groups still carry those strange, ultra-deep ancestral lineages at all? The ones diverging tens of thousands of years before Shum Laka's population even existed. If the ancient forest population was wiped out and replaced, where did that other ancestry come from? Replacement explains why the ancient DNA at Shum Laka disappeared. It does not explain the far stranger, far older ancestry still hiding inside living Congolese populations today. That requires a second, considerably stranger explanation. Replacement explains why the ancient DNA at Shum Laka disappeared. It does not explain the far stranger, far older ancestry still hiding inside living Congolese populations today. That requires a second, considerably stranger explanation. Because if a population truly vanished from the Congo Basin, something else was already there long before it arrived. Something whose DNA never should have survived at all, and did anyway. The second theory doesn't try to explain what disappeared. It tries to explain what refused to. Researchers including Xie, Werner, Wall, and colleagues, in a 2016 paper published in Genome Research, along with earlier work by Lachance and colleagues in 2012, identified something buried inside the genomes of living rainforest hunter-gatherers that has nothing to do with Shum Laka, nothing to do with Bantu farmers, and nothing to do with any population currently known to science. Call it ghost archaic admixture. Think of it as a genetic fingerprint left by someone who was never booked, never photographed, never entered into any known record. Only the fingerprint remains, and it doesn't match anyone on file. The genomic evidence suggests this lineage split from the ancestors of modern humans roughly 700,000 years ago. For scale, that is far earlier than the split between modern humans and Neanderthals. This isn't a distant cousin, it's closer to an entirely separate branch of the family tree, one that somehow found its way back into the trunk. Estimates suggest this archaic ancestry makes up roughly 2 to 5% of some rainforest hunter-gatherer genomes today, a proportion comparable to the amount of Neanderthal ancestry carried by modern Europeans. And unlike Neanderthals, there is no skeleton, no skull in a museum drawer, no fossil anyone can point to and say, "There, that's them." The entire population is inferred purely from the statistical shadow it left in DNA. An entire lineage of ancient humans, known only because their descendants, generations later, still carry the paperwork. Here is where it gets complicated in a new direction. If this archaic lineage persisted for 700,000 years and still shows up clearly in people alive today, then the story of this region isn't simply replacement, the way Theory 1 suggested. Some ancestries in the Congo Basin turn out to be almost incomprehensibly old and resilient, surviving longer than agriculture, longer than pottery, longer than language itself has been traceable. And yet other ancestries, like the Shum Laka lineage, vanished almost entirely within a few thousand years. The same region, the same rough time span, producing two opposite outcomes. One lineage erased almost overnight, another surviving 750,000 years without leaving a single bone behind. Even this theory comes with a hedge attached. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Geneticists still disagree on whether this signal represents a genuinely distinct hominin lineage or an extreme case of population substructure within Homo sapiens itself, an ancient and isolated branch of our own species rather than a separate one. The debate remains unresolved, actively argued in journals to this day. If an entire hominin lineage can hide inside living DNA, undetected, for 700,000 years, the obvious question follows: what else is Central Africa's genome still hiding? Here is the part that most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, because it doesn't offer a single villain, a single population, a single clean answer at all. The most unsettling possibility isn't one ghost population, it's several, overlapping, interbreeding, splitting apart and merging again in patterns no clean family tree can actually capture. Under what's sometimes called the multiple deep divergences model, Western rainforest hunter-gatherer groups, the Baka, the Biaka, and Eastern groups, the Mbuti, the Efe, may not descend from a single ancestral pygmy population at all. They may descend from at least two, possibly more, independently ancient lineages, each one evolving in isolation for tens of thousands of years, before later exchanging genes with incoming farming populations at different times, at different rates, in different parts of the forest. Patton and colleagues, in a 2017 paper published in Science, mapped exactly this kind of complexity. Multiple, staggered waves of admixture between farmer and forager groups across Central Africa, rather than one clean meeting point in history. Push the theory to its speculative edge, and the picture gets stranger still. Some researchers propose that what gets labeled Bantu ancestry in a modern Congolese genetic sample isn't one thing either. It may itself be a blend of at least three distinct deep lineages. the agricultural expansion component most people assume it to be, a western rainforest hunter-gatherer component absorbed somewhere along the way, and a faint, residual, nearly erased component connected to populations like the one buried at Shum Laka. Even this needs a hedge attached to it. This three-lineage, or more, model remains actively debated. Ancient DNA sample sizes from the region stay small. Modern reference panels remain incomplete. No one is claiming certainty here, only a pattern that keeps surfacing every time someone looks closer. No one alive can say, with any real certainty, how many distinct peoples had to disappear, blend into each other, or hide inside one another's DNA to produce a single Congolese genome as it exists today. Picture standing at the mouth of the Shum Laka rock shelter itself. Cool basalt overhead. Cameroonian highland grasses rolling downhill toward the dark tree line of the rainforest below. The site sits near the modern city of Bamenda in Cameroon's northwest region. Geographically, it is the literal hinge point between the proposed Bantu homeland and the Congo rainforest proper. Not a symbolic hinge, an actual one, walkable in a single afternoon. Beneath your feet, layered soil holds roughly 8,000 years of intermittent human occupation. Tools, hearths, burials, stacked in sequence like pages in a book nobody could read until very recently. That soil sat largely undisturbed until 20th century archaeological excavations. And then, in 2020, until a small, ancient DNA sampling effort finally extracted something readable from bone that had waited 8 millennia to be asked a question. Imagine holding a single tooth or bone fragment from that layer, small enough to sit in the palm of one hand, old enough to predate written language on every inhabited continent on Earth. That fragment is the entire physical source of a genome that rewired an academic consensus a century in the making. Now look south. A few hundred kilometers away, the descendants of a completely different, much later demographic wave speak Bantu languages, farm the land, and identify today as Cameroonian or Congolese, entirely unaware that the oldest known genome from their own region isn't, genetically speaking, theirs at all. Standing at that rock shelter, the ground itself holds 2 irreconcilable family trees. Only one of them is still alive to tell its story. Here is the reframe that changes everything that came before it. The Congolese, as a single genetic category, may never have existed to begin with. The term is a modern political and linguistic label draped over at least 3 or 4 genetically distinct, deeply ancient human lineages that happen to occupy the same territory today. Reassemble the pieces laid out so far. The vanished Shum Laka-related population, contributing almost nothing to anyone alive. The deeply diverged rainforest hunter-gatherer lineages, themselves internally split between east and west by tens of thousands of years. The possible 700,000-year-old ghost archaic component, hiding inside some of those same forager genomes. And finally, the comparatively recent, 3,000 to 5,000-year-old Bantu language-associated agricultural expansion, layered on top of all of it. State the reframe plainly. What looks, in a modern genetic survey, like the Congolese people, is actually a composite signal. A genetic palimpsest, one population's history, written over another's, over another's, over another's. And the most numerically dominant ancestry in that palimpsest, the Bantu-associated layer, is also the youngest. The oldest ancestries are the ones most diluted, most nearly erased, hardest to detect. This is where the sharpest twist lands. The popular assumption that rainforest hunter-gatherer groups are the unchanged, ancient population and Bantu-speaking farmers are the newcomers turns out to be only half right. Genetically, every single group in the Congo Basin today is a blend. Not one living population is a clean, unmixed descendant of the region's oldest known inhabitants. Not the farmers, not the foragers, no one. And the Shum Laka data drives the point home one final time. The individuals with the single strongest claim to being original Central Africans, by sheer age alone, left no living genetic heirs at all. Being first, it turns out, and being ancestral are 2 entirely different things, and an entire field of identity politics, land rights, and cultural heritage claims has spent a century treating them as the same one. Dr. Alain Froment, a physical anthropologist who has worked directly with rainforest hunter-gatherer communities in Cameroon, has described the discomfort this creates in plain terms. The science keeps outrunning the categories people use to understand themselves. An elder in a Baka community, asked what the DNA means for who his people are, might answer the same way. Not with a number, but with a shrug toward the forest itself. The land remembers what the tests are still trying to catch up to. The Congo Basin didn't preserve one ancient people. It consumed several and gave the resulting mixture names that none of those ancient people would have recognized. What happened here isn't an isolated anomaly. It's a preview of what ancient DNA keeps finding almost anywhere humans have lived long enough to leave a layered record. From Britain to the Andes to the Congo, population geneticists keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Indigenous and original are far less stable categories than any culture assumes them to be. Replace, blend, erase, repeat. Most populations alive today are the product of that cycle running many times over, not a single unbroken line running back to the beginning. Ethnic and national identities across Central Africa, Bantu-speaking, rainforest hunter-gatherer, or otherwise, were built on cultural and linguistic continuity. Shared language, shared custom, shared land. Not strict genetic continuity, and the two, culture and genome, rarely line up as neatly as the last century of scholarship assumed they would. This isn't only an academic footnote. For communities whose political standing and land rights arguments have rested on claims of ancient, unbroken ancestry, this kind of genetic complexity carries real weight. It unsettles arguments built, in good faith, on a version of history that the DNA no longer fully supports. The Shum Laka lineage's disappearance remains unexplained. The ghost archaic signal remains undated to any known population. The true number of ancestral lineages hiding inside a single modern Congolese genome remains, by the field's own admission, an open question rather than a closed case. Think of it, in the end, as a river system rather than a single stream. Countless tributaries merging, some running dry centuries ago, others flowing on beneath the surface long after their source was forgotten. All of it arriving, eventually, at the same wide, single-looking river mouth that every modern genetic survey mistakes for one continuous flow. The Congolese were never who we thought they were, and the DNA revealing that truth only proves how much of that truth is still missing.